Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. Today we're going to be exploring a little bit about Microsoft Excel and kind of exploring a couple of ways that you, for your nonprofit, could possibly use Excel to help with some basic tasks. We've all run into those areas as some of those things where you need to see more data than you have available, and or you've got data from different sources and you want to be able to do something that requires you to combine them. Excel is a really powerful tool that helps us to do that. And so before we get started, just a quick introduction here. My name is David Bentz. I'm the director of our project management office here at Advisicon. I have been working across a lot of different industries over the years, but I did spend some time working for a nonprofit as a director of operations, and so plenty of experience working with putting together donor reports, processing transactions, mailing list updates, all those communications that you always need to do. And so I'm really passionate about tools and being able to help make systems easier to use and more repeatable so that we can eliminate some of the manual data entry that needs to happen. And Excel can often be a very good tool for that. Today, we're going to be looking a little bit about maybe a couple of different data sources where we might be getting information that we would process in Excel. We'll look at a couple of quick formatting tips and how to set up a table in Excel, as well as using a couple of my favorite formulas, especially the VLOOKUP formula, and a couple of text to data extraction formulas to help parse some of the information that's coming from one of our sample sources. And then finally, if we have a little bit of time left, we'll take a quick look at exploring visualizing some of that data in a pivot table and a chart. So one of the things that we look at, so for our sample scenario today here, we're going to be looking at the scenario of I've got online donor data, maybe it's in a system like PayPal or Stripe, that has very limited information other than just the transaction, the amount, and maybe some weird identifiable data about the person there, but I want to send them a letter. And so, maybe I have a mailing list that I've put together, either in a service like MailChimp, or maybe you actually have a database for your CRM, or maybe you're just simply maintaining the list in Excel in a different spreadsheet. Doesn't matter. Wherever that data set comes from, we can work with it. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and switch on over and we're going to use the tool. So I have here a couple of sample files that we'll work with, and we're going to start with taking a look at a sample mailing list. So this right here, I'll zoom in just a little bit so it's a little easier to read, as an example of an export that you might get from a service like MailChimp or your CRM, where we've got basically, kind of a name here that's just simply, hey, we've got, we're just looking at the various information here. We've got the name of the person, their street address, city, state, zip, and then as we scroll over, we can see we've got an email address here, we've got phone numbers, and then we have a couple of fields that are going to be of key interest to us here. We've got a person ID and a record number field. And then we also have, in addition to that, hold on just a second here, grab our transaction sample. So this is something that might be representative of an export that you might get from a service like PayPal or Stripe. If you just simply exported all the transactions in a particular date range, you get something like this. You'd have a weird transaction ID number. You might have the email address from the person, and then like what tender type they use, whether it was a credit card or a check or cash, the amount of the transaction, the date of the transaction. You'll note here we also have this record number column in this case. So when we're looking at multiple data sets and we want to be able to extract information from them, the most important piece is that there's some piece of information that's common to the two data sets and has to be unique to a particular record. So for example, in this sample, I have a column that's called record number that happens to be the same as a column that's called record number here in my mailing list. I'm sorry, that's the wrong spreadsheet. There's my mailing list. Also have a record number in here. In this example, we had set up the two systems previously to have a common ID number between the two. But say you don't have that. Maybe you just simply have a spreadsheet mailing list and you're working straight from Stripe or PayPal. Usually the email address is probably going to be your best bet to use as a common factor, because for the most part, people have one email address, maybe multiple, but it's something that you can usually use as a pretty unique piece of information to use. And that's going to be important when we go into the formulas for the next step here. So I want to take these two lists of data that I've got that are messy, it's pretty hard to read, there's a ton of just data in columns here, and I want to be able to do something useful with it. So the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to copy both of those worksheets into a third worksheet. Now this isn't totally required because I can use formulas to go across workbooks, but I've found my experience has been that if I've got a bunch of different spreadsheets that I'm pulling data from, inevitably somebody moves or deletes one of the files in that folder, and then you can't find the data that you need, and all of a sudden you get a ton of errors from your Excel formulas telling you can't find the information you're looking for. So I find it's a lot of times just easier to go ahead and we'll copy those over. So you can see I've got tabs down here where I've got a transactions tab where I copied that information over from the data from that transactions export. And I also have another worksheet here where I copied the data over from the mailing list. Now, for starters, this is really hard to read, and you can't really see much of information in here. And if I needed to do something where I was just simply printing it, Excel has a function that you can format data as tables, and there's a really easy way to do that. So if you just simply have this data set selected, I'm just going to put my cursor, I'm going to select cell A1 because that's basically the top of this table here. And because all this data is continuous, there's no gaps or spaces in it, I can just simply go up here into the Home tab of the ribbon, and over here in this middle section you can see here, right here, we're going to look at this piece and we're going to choose this Format as a Table option. And I tend to like tables with banded rows, so as we can see here as we're looking into, unfortunately I can't zoom in on that, but we can see here we've got just regular banded rows, we've got headers with regular tables, and then a whole bunch of styles here that have a header row and then a bunch of banded alternating rows. So we're going to pick this style right here for now. And you can see in this box here it says where's the data, and it automatically selected the range of data here because this is a continuous data range. And because I've already got a header row at the very top, I'm going to check the box that says my table has headers and click OK, and voila, instant formatted data that's a lot easier to read. So tables are a really neat way to be able to do that kind of stuff with a data set. It's very quick and easy, and now I've got a very much more human readable list of data. If I just needed to print or maybe cut or hide a couple of these columns, I'd have a quick list that I could print out now. But I want to go a step further. So I want to merge these two data sets together and be able to pull information. I want to know how many donations a particular person has made. So I'm going to start with, I've made a third worksheet here that has a table that's going to combine the two data sets, pertinent information from them. So I copied across some of the transaction information. So the transaction ID, the person ID, and the transaction date from that transaction table. And then I copied over the transaction amount and the tender type columns here as well. Then I did two additional things here that will make this data a lot easier to report on later. This transaction date column that came from our transaction table was just a standard text export. So it's not currently formatted as a date. Excel is just recognizing this as a text field. And so since I want it to be an actual date so that we can do some reporting on it later, we're going to make use of a function called the date value function. And as we can see here, the format for this is just simply the word date value. And so to explore this a little bit more, we're going to go ahead and I'll just delete this formula for now. Go equals, and when you're looking for formulas, if you know the formula name, you can just start typing it, and Excel will put an autofill of various formulas that you might be looking for. You can also look them up in the FX editor if you don't know exactly what you're looking for, or our best friend Google is always a good time. How do I do this in Excel? Guarantee you, you'll get a lot of really good hits right off the bat. So we're going to use the date value function, and you can see as we hover over this with the cursor, the explanation text says it converts the date in the form of text to a number that represents the date in Microsoft Excel date time code, which is exactly what we want to do. And now Excel helps us out by telling us, hey, here's the syntax. I'm expecting to have a value here that will show me what the date text is. So we know that the value that we want is in this column right next door here. So since this data is formatted as a table, instead of saying cell C2, it's giving me this reference that's saying at transaction date because it's actually doing the data manipulation in the table itself. So we'll close the formula with a parentheses and hit return, and it'll automatically fill the formula down for the rest of the table. So now that we've extracted the date into a usable form, we're going to go across here, and now I want to match to the person that this transaction happened from. So we'll use the VLOOKUP formula in order to do that. We start out, and we'll just go ahead and clear this away. So we can see here that I've already put in the VLOOKUP formula that we need. Right here. So this is the syntax for that formula that's going to basically look up the record ID number against the transaction table, from this transaction table against our mailing list data, and we're going to pull a name in for that so that we have a name to match for the transaction. To kind of replicate that really quick, we'll go through the steps. So I'm going to go equals VLOOKUP. We can see that's already there. If the formula that you want is highlighted, you can just simply hit the tab key to autocomplete. So I'm going to say the lookup value. What value am I going to look up in order to use as my matching data? And so in this example, I formatted the table, and we're going to actually use this record number field because that was our common data point that we had. But like I said before, if you only had an email address between the two systems, that could also be used. I recommend against using more common things like names because chances are pretty good you might have more than one Bob Smith in a large mailing list. So we're going to go ahead and select that first cell here. So we're going to look up the person ID value, and we put a comma in. And the table array is important. This is where do I want to look for the data. So in this example, we're going to look for data that matches this against our mailing list. So we want to pull the name from the mailing list to match that into the transactions. So I'm going to go ahead and click the mailing list tab at the bottom here. And I'm going to just highlight all the columns across here. Now, I don't need to highlight the whole table because the data that I want is in column 2. But for this example, we're just going to go ahead and highlight the whole table. So we can see now, as we look in the formula fields, I now have mailing list A through J, columns A through J highlighted. And now we'll tell it the index. One important thing I forgot to mention about the VLOOKUP formula is that it's really important the lookup value that you're using is the first column of data in your table array. So in this example, I formatted the data so that the record number column is column A. It doesn't have to be column A, but it does have to be the first column of data that you're selecting because basically you're telling Excel, look for this value in this table and start from this row and then look to the right. So that's how the VLOOKUP formula works. So now that we've told it what we want to look up against, we want to look up that person ID, and we're going to look it up against the mailing list table. And now we have to tell it how many columns over do you want to count. So we want to look for the name, which we can see is in the second column of data here. And so we're going to tell it to look for column index 2. So that's now telling it, Excel, I want you to look for this person ID in this table of data, and you're going to count over 2 columns and pull back the value that's in that when you find a match. This final piece here is this true versus true or false for exact match or approximate match. In most cases, if you have your data sorted in some kind of alphabetical or numerical order, you can use the true match, and as soon as it finds something that looks pretty close to what you're looking for, it'll grab it. In most cases, my data that I'm looking at is usually pretty messy, so I find that I use the false match. This will only return something that has an exact match to your lookup value, and that's usually the safest way to do it. If you're processing really, really large data sets, like in the orders of more than 20 or 30,000 rows of data, the VLOOKUP formula can get a little bit processor intensive. And so there's other formulas that you might want to consider, like XLOOKUP, or even considering using a Power BI report. But in our example, the VLOOKUP formula is perfect. So we're going to go double click on that false, and we'll close this out. And so now we've put the name of the person in this table. We need to do the same thing to pull the mailing address list in here just to kind of have a particular piece. And so I did the exact same thing looking up that donor record, but now we counted over 3 columns to grab the address information. So now I have a nice table of data that has all my transaction data, but I've added the name and address of the person who made the transaction. Really quick and easy. That took me less than 5 minutes to put together. So maybe I want to be able to do some reporting on that data. And that's where we come into the pivot table. Pivot tables are really awesome. It's a really great way to be able to summarize data. You can see I've already built a couple of tables here, and let's see if I can zoom in on this a little bit better here. I basically looked, this is all data from that donor transactions table, and I've done a couple of things here. I've done a roll up by person to where I can see Gage Alexander's total donations that he's ever made, and that's really kind of handy. I can take a look at and see, okay, maybe I want to know how many people are paying by credit cards versus checks or cash. So I've got this breakout of transactions by tender type. And then I want to just do year summary roll-ups. And so I've got this whole, okay, I've got by year, 2018, 19, and 20. Perfect. Now, we want to show how did I do that. Okay, well, the easiest way to do it is to start with just up here in the Insert menu, across the top of the ribbon here, we've got an Insert tab. And we can see one of our options here, and I must have something selected. Okay, we'll click out of that so that I have the pivot table option here. Now, when I hit this drop down, I can just simply create a new pivot table. Selecting a table or range is really interesting because what I can do is if I go ahead and just select, I can select a random range of data cells, but since our data is formatted as a table, I can actually select the table itself. And so what I want to do is I'm going to cancel out of this. I'll go back to the shortcut, go back to my donor transactions table here. And if I select a cell in this table and I hit the pivot table, it's automatically pre-filled the name of that table as my table range. And you can either choose whether you want to put your new report in a new worksheet, adding a new worksheet to your workbook, or whether you want to just add it to an existing one. For this example, we'll go ahead and add it to a new worksheet. So now we have the pivot table creator. And I have over here on the right, I have my list of available fields from that table, and whether I want to put them in rows, columns, values, or whether I use them in filters. So we'll go ahead and rebuild that example of we want to summarize the donations by year. So I'm going to start with putting years in my rows. You can see it added the years to the rows. Now what do I want to sum? I want to sum the actual transaction amounts. So I'm going to drag the transaction amounts into values. And Excel was able to interpret that since that was a text field, I probably want to add it. And so it made it a sum. But sometimes it might pull it in as a count of or something like that. And you might have to, in the values section, there's a little drop-down arrow. And you might have to go to value field settings and change whether you're doing a sum, count, average, max, or min, or several other functions that are available here. Most of the time, you're probably going to either do a sum, a count, or an average. And if we want to rename this, so we're just going to say, we're just going to call this transaction totals. The only restrictions on naming here is I can't name this field the same name as a name of a column header from the table. You will get an error message if you try to do that. And okay, we want to be able to read this a little bit better, so that's not exactly a very readable. So another thing that I can do in the value field settings, down here at the bottom, as is in the case in most other areas of Excel, we have a number format section, and this is currency, so I want to format it as currency. 2 decimal places is fine, and now we're showing this as currency. So I've now got a table by year where I can see this. Now one of the cool things that we can do is I can also break this out in a couple of different ways. So say maybe I want to be able to do underneath each year, I want to be able to do by person. So I'm going to just go ahead and drag the donor name column underneath years here. And now we have a list of all of the donors that made donations in 2020. And I can hit the little minus sign next to here so I can still do my collapse roll up. And I can still see that summary of data. But if I want to expand and see 2020 and see who donated in 2020, great, here's all this stuff. And say maybe I want to sort these people from high to low, like I want to see my top donors first. I can right click on this information and I can sort Z to A. Actually, the easier way to do this is to up in the row labels, the drop down arrow here. I want to select my field, donor name, and then we're going to do a more sort options. Because now what I want to do is I'm going to sort in descending order, and then I get to pick which field I'm going to sort it by. I want to sort it by transaction totals. So this will now, instead of sorting the names alphabetically, it's sorting me from highest donor to lowest donor, which is usually a pretty nice thing because then I can quickly see information there. I can also do things like, if we're doing value filters, we can look for top 10. Okay, show me the top 10. I'll make sure we select the right field that we're sorting on here, but I want to do value filters to say top 10. by transaction totals. And it'll show me my top 10 donors. That's a pretty handy one. I want to go ahead and we'll go ahead and clear that filter. Another piece of information you can add is the column heading across the pivot table to be able to say we want to group things by. So maybe I want to be able to look at both pieces of data. In that other example that we had here, I had a separate pivot table that was showing my transactions by tender type, and if we expand here, I've got that grouped by year now, or transactions by year, and then we've got it by month. That's also pretty handy. But maybe I want to go through and I want to take a look at, I want to add in by year and then see across the columns what's the breakout that year by tender type. So I can add the tender type field to this columns tab, and immediately now I have totals by year by the particular tender types. I still have my grand total over here on the far right, but in between I have all the rest of the information for the various other tender types. So it's really quick and easy to say I want to see this data in a bunch of different ways. So that's a really pretty handy feature. But maybe you're making a presentation somewhere and you need to be able to show some graphs. Well, Excel also does that really well too. And we'll look at that in terms of the pie charts. So for example, if we're looking across some of these summaries, so we have this table transactions by year, maybe I want to be able to look at that as a bar graph to say how are our donations trending year over year. Well, if I simply select this pivot chart and I go up to the insert menu here, I'm going to be able to go under, there's all these chart options here, and it's a little bit small on this screen, but you can see there's all kinds of chart options that you can see. We've got bar graphs, we've got scatter plots, we've got histograms, we've got pie charts, and so maybe you're overwhelmed by that, and you can say maybe I know exactly what I want, maybe I don't, but Excel also gives you this recommended charts idea. So it'll take a quick look at that data and say, based on that data, we think you probably want to use this kind of chart. So we're going to try that. We hit the recommended chart, and you can see that it recommended a column chart, which is probably what we want here. And we've got some different options for how we might want to format that column chart, but I like the version that's currently sitting right here. So we'll go ahead and insert that, and you see now I've got this handy chart right here. Now, what's great about these is it's interactive because it's still linked to the chart, the pivot table that we put it from. So if I expand one of these years here, we can see that it also updated the graphic to where I can now see the month-by-month totals for the year of 2018, and then it's still just showing the roll-up summary for 2019. So the chart automatically adapts based on what's in the pivot table, which is really handy. Now, this middle table here is really kind of an example of a breakout of like the total, broken up into different categorizations. So once again, we'll hit this and we'll hit the insert menu, recommended charts. It's still recommended a column graph. Well, that's probably okay, but maybe what we want to do is actually a pie chart. So let's take a look at a pie chart option here. And I think I like that first one there, so I'm going to go ahead and pick that. And so now we can see the breakout of here's our basic, grouping by the various tender types and what percentage they make. And I'm going to expand that a little bit so we can see all the options in our key here. But again, we can now see here's our breakout of that. And maybe I want to see by year. Now in the pie chart, sometimes that expansion of data doesn't make a whole lot of sense because now we just got a breakout in a pie chart, and we've got 3 different things here that are all Visa here, but they're kind of different colors. And so that might be less useful. But as a general whole, we can quickly see, okay, Visa accompanies basically a quarter of our transactions. And then checks here is a pretty good portion, as well as cash. So, that might be an interesting thing to be looking at to say, what is the bulk of our transactions coming in? How are we processing things? And this is a quick way to visualize some of that data. All right. Now that we've kind of looked at a little bit of the chart representations, we've got a little bit more of formatting and other interesting information that we can look at here. So one of the pieces that we talked about was doing a mailing. So again here, I've now combined both the mailing list and the transaction table information here to be able to look at, hey, I had my last name field, but I want to be able to write a letter to this person. So I used another formula, which is a little bit more complicated than we can get into right now, but I'm able to do a text extraction that was basically able to extract the first name because all of the names are separated by a comma. So basically the formula is basically looking to say, look at the name field and then look for where the comma is, go over 2 characters, and then the rest of that is the first name. So that was a quick and easy way to be able to split this up into first and last names. And then I brought in the address information. And then we also did a roll-up here. So maybe if you're doing a year-end letter, you might want to be able to say, somebody's donated monthly. You want to say quickly, hey, thank you for your gifts this year in the amount of whatever. And so over here, we did a conditional sum formula that basically is looking at, and we'll get back out here, to say, let's grab all the transactions for this person. So say, Bob Smith has 10 entries in the transaction table for the year 2019. So I'm looking at this and saying, we're going to sum the transaction amounts in the transaction table if the transaction record ID equals the person's record ID from this table, and they also have a transaction year of 2019, because we're specifically looking at the 2019 donations. So when that formula runs, this person here had a donation total of this amount for the year 2019. We're running out of time for today, and there's so many more things that I would love to cover in this, but we're just barely scratching the surface on today's course. So if you saw something in here that was helpful, please let us know, contact us. We would love to hear from you at Advisicon, and we'd love to be able to help you. So if there's something in this that you thought maybe you need some help getting to the next level for your organization, please reach out. We always love to help. So thank you guys for tuning in today, and I hope that you learned something from this and came away with some additional knowledge of how you can use Excel to help make your team work better. So thank you very much.